Hi, and welcome to episode number 4 of my podcast series, What Does Coffee Mean to You? And yeah, it's a coffee podcast that has nothing to do with coffee. I think by now we know this. And why is this important? Well, it's because we find inspiration, ideas, perspectives in so many different places. And there's so much value in learning from other professionals. And I think the guest that I have with me today in this episode is just such an amazing opportunity, an example of this. Dan Rubin, a photographer, I think first a creative, entrepreneur, a designer, so many things, a singer, a performer, a coach. The list just goes on and on and on. And there's so many things that we didn't even manage to talk about in this episode, but such an amazing just intake of inspiration. Before I recorded this intro, because I record the intros after the presentation or after the conversation, and I just had to take like a few minutes and just sit and reflect on it, because this was just the kind of conversation I needed to have. And I think it's been a while since I've been getting this much kind of creative input and perspective and ideas on something. And I think just an extraordinary opportunity to be here, and just want to give Dan like an extra thank you for making time. He's in Copenhagen now for a book signing and launch from a project that he's been kind of part of curating for his photographer friend, and wished him all the best in that, of course. In this episode, we talk about his journey. We talk about photography. We talk about perspectives, staying creative in the world as the world kind of changes, and as you are changing as a person as well. Dan is one of the first beta testers of Instagram, for example, and he's been in the forefront in the photography world for quite some time. And for me, that has really very little insight in the world of photography. This was eye-opening, and I hope this episode is just as inspiring to you as it just was for me. So enjoy. Here is Dan Rubin, and really a conversation about life. That's the best way I can put it. I hope you enjoy the episode. So, hi everyone. Dan is with us here, which is amazing. Welcome to Copenhagen.
Thank you.
You guys have already got basically an introduction of what we're doing here and who this gentleman is. And obviously we're going to dig deeper into it, but we're going to jump straight into it pretty much, right? With the first question, which is, what does coffee mean to you?
Love this as a starting point. I'm about 15 years into being a coffee drinker properly since I moved to the UK from Miami. So my relationship with coffee is both one of kind of not newness necessarily, but it still feels very new to me, because when you discover something once you're in your 30s, when you feel like you've established your patterns and your likes and your dislikes, especially when that thing you discover is something that you thought you didn't like, which was my relationship with coffee beforehand, it takes on a different role in your life. And I'm also not a big drinker alcohol-wise. I'm allergic to beer and wine for various reasons. So I can drink spirits, but I don't drink a lot. So when I meet people, I meet them over coffee as well. So for me, coffee is this thing where, for me, it's still a new and exciting thing that I love discovering, brewing at home, finding new beans, finding new coffee shops when I travel. It's a lot around newness, but it's also a connector. It's something that I use as maybe a social crutch, but I think everyone does. You ask someone to meet for coffee for any reason, and they're probably going to say yes, even if they don't drink coffee. We kind of understand that the coffee house is plays a certain role in society, and it has for a long time, from what I've dug up over these last 15 years of getting more and more interested in it. So
for sure, and I think it's socially, it's okay to meet someone in a coffee shop. Meeting someone in a restaurant, meeting someone in a bar, it could be a different kind of connotation to it, right? But meeting in a coffee shop is a very just like safe safe place to be, right?
It's an accepted public space. And you're right. Saying, do you want to meet for drinks? Or do you want to meet for dinner? Or even do you want to meet for lunch or breakfast? Or all of those things carry very different amounts of social weight. They have different connotations and they're different cues. And coffee, I think, is accepted as neutral, which is great. Not that coffee itself is neutral. I think it's quite polarizing.
Oh, sure. I think coffee can be a lot of things, right? But it is neutral in the sense that it's for everyone, I think. Because different cultures and different people, we all like different styles of coffee, but we still drink coffee, right? I mean, the beverage the essence of it is the same, right? But the interpretation and how it's bring forward is sometimes different, right?
Something that I find fascinating with coffee in that regard is that not everyone drinks coffee. My partner doesn't drink coffee. My mother doesn't drink coffee. She's a tea drinker. She grew up in the UK. I was a tea drinker before I moved to the UK, which is really crazy that I grew up in the US, which is a coffee country, but I grew up drinking tea and not liking coffee. And then I moved to the UK. And once I'm in London around all of these great coffee roasters, I suddenly start drinking more coffee and not tea. But my partner doesn't drink coffee, but my mom and my partner and other people I know who don't drink it, they don't like the taste of it. They love the smell of it. So there's an additional layer there of comfort. Tea doesn't smell like anything unless you're kind of putting your face in the leaves, right? You brew a pot of tea, it doesn't really change the aroma of the room, but you brew coffee and it changes the place, it changes the environment. And I haven't met a single person. It's kind of like bacon. Like even vegetarians love the smell of bacon. It's just this really strange. Yeah. I think there are certain olfactory things that are almost universal where even if someone doesn't like the thing, the food or the beverage, the smell of it registers in a different way.
Do you have so like now I'm kind of I'm jumping ahead here, but now I'm just curious, is there a translation to a similar sensation from a visual photo film perspective for you? Like, what would the representation of that be?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there are, not that we're going to in this conversation, but you could dig into Gestalt theory and find a lot of answers in this way. Just like certain words, depending on the language, have a pleasant sound. And everyone would agree that regardless of the meaning of the word, it sounds nice. I think the same thing happens visually. There are just certain patterns. Color is obviously a big driver for a lot of people. But there are certain shapes and combinations of elements that are inherently pleasing. I think about the circle, and it's just kind of this universally accepted shape that is pleasing to everyone, and it represents all sorts of other things, and we can layer a lot of meaning onto what a circle represents depending on its use, depending on its context. But I think when you're talking about even photography, so much of photography is composition. It's why black and white photography is still such a strong medium in this world where we don't need black and white photography. Black and white was the photographic color palette before we had color. It was just out of necessity. It hasn't gone away because contrast and shape and form still have so much meaning. So I think there are parallels. There are things that are just, I think, inherently pleasing to us. I feel this a lot in nature. So I know just talked about circles, and there are no perfect circles really, not none, but there are very few perfect circles in nature. I mean, ripples in water are one example. So they show up, but I personally feel very comfortable when I'm in nature, when I'm as far away from anything man-made as possible. And I'm saying that as someone who loves man-made things. I'm a designer. I'm a product designer in addition to other things. I love making things. I love creating form. But I'm most at peace when I'm in the mountains or in a forest or in the middle of a field, because nature just has its own harmony. And I think that's probably more along the lines of how things might relate to that place that coffee holds. Because when we're in nature, when we're surrounded by nature, everything is balanced. Not everyone's comfortable with that. I get that. Some people really don't like the silence that you get in the middle of nature. But I think visually, everything is balanced. Everything in nature is where it's supposed to be, regardless of whether you're in a desert or the most dense forest or at the top of a mountain range.
I agree with that, and I think it's it's grounding, right? I think we've seen that in philosophers over the years. We've seen that in so much mindfulness and so on, right? Where nature grounds you, right, and it keeps you out from something man-made and created, which like all of this is, right, which is beautiful in its own right, right? But I think there's always a need to escape and go back to the roots of what we do. I think that's important both professionally, but on any kind of level, there's something very comforting with that, right? And nature is, as you say, it's a kind of a perfect imperfection in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which also makes it very human, because it's kind of how we are, right? And I think that kind of that idea is really interesting, and I think it's very comforting sometimes, especially when you, I don't know, run a company in this day and age or whatever. It's a good reminder, right, that there is perfection in those kind of imperfections, right? And sometimes, and we're gonna touch on this as well, I'm sure, right? But sometimes projects just don't work out the way they should, right? But maybe let's touch on something that is a little bit more current, because you are in Copenhagen for a reason, right?
I am.
And that reason is not being on this podcast. I just kind of stole them away. What brings you to Copenhagen this time?
Well, this is a very exciting trip to Copenhagen. Not that other trips to Copenhagen haven't been exciting. I always love being in this city. I think I've been coming here for about 10 years on and off. And this time it's to launch a book that I've curated and designed for another photographer based in Miami. His name is AJ Woomer. And he and I have become really good friends since we've met about 5 years ago. And around the time we met, right, kind of at the end of the initial wave of the pandemic, when people were starting to kind of meet and connect again, he started a project. He didn't even know he had started it, but he had his first trip to Copenhagen shooting Fashion Week for some friends who ran a fashion label. And he came back to the States after that trip, and he felt something he hadn't felt before. And it was his first time in Copenhagen, and it was his first time in Scandinavia. It might have even been his first time in Europe. And he knew that he needed to go back. So he went back to Copenhagen about 6 months later, came back from that trip, and we had this conversation where he knew that he was making a body of work. He didn't know what it was going to be yet, but he knew he had to turn this into a project and turn this into a thing. So I've kind of been checking in with him throughout this project, and as it became clear it was going to become a book, and I could see how good this material was going to be, all shot on film as well, which is my favorite medium, but it's a great way to kind of be in a place and not be distracted by what you're making. So he would come for a week, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at a time, and not see any of what he was capturing, because it was just all on film, and you wouldn't see it until maybe a week or 2 weeks or maybe even a month later. And then he could reflect on what that most recent trip meant to him. And that's how this project kind of came about. So I've been working on the actual book and the curation with him for just over a year now, where we realized that he needed, to have one more trip, which he did this past May, to capture some final images that were kind of missing from the overall body of, which was thousands of images at that point. And we've designed it over the summer, printed it in Denmark, went to press a couple of weeks ago, got delivered here on Tuesday, and we have the book launch tomorrow night. So that's the reason for me arriving today. And it's really exciting, because it's always exciting to see something you've made or helped to make come into the world physically. So much of what we do these days, all of us, gets done online. Even when you make a physical product, even when you're selling coffee, you've got to sell it online. You have to sell it in pixels and bytes. And even as someone I've been online and I've been using computers for most of my life, I love them. But I don't want my life to exist only in that form. I feel it's very important to have tangible evidence of the things that I do. And part of that is in my process. I like using pen and paper and pencil and even mechanical typewriters for my daily kind of notes. I'd like to be off screens whenever I can. But it's also important to make things that people can hold and take with them. And a book is, especially for photographers, where so much of our output ends up, whether it's for a client or ourselves, it ends up on a screen somewhere. People don't really print anymore. They don't have, gallery exhibitions as much as they maybe used to. People don't even make books as much as they maybe used to, because you don't have to. You put everything out online, and that's how you reach people. So it makes the book even more of a special artifact. And I know that this book of Andrew's is going to be received really well. It's an amazing thing. I've been living with this work, watching the work come together and treating it almost as if it's my own for a very long time now. And it's kind of reached that point where it's blurred in my head, where I'll see the pictures and forget momentarily that I didn't take them, because I've spent so much time getting to know this work. And it's also it's this love letter to Copenhagen, which I also feel because I love the city and AJ loves the city. I think he wants to move here one day already. He's made up his mind. He wants to leave the US at some point, and Copenhagen is where he thinks he'll land, which is also kind of great to, when you have a friend especially, and you see them go through that journey, especially for me as someone who grew up of two countries, my mother British, my dad American, but I grew up in the States. But I had two cultures that were, even though they shared a language, very, very different. And I've left the US and lived overseas now for 15 years. And so when you see a friend starting to make that same kind of change and learn something else about themselves and build a relationship with themselves through another country, especially for Americans who don't tend to leave the country in the first place. So many of them. It's kind of a proud moment to see all of this come together. So yeah, that's why I'm here, and it's really exciting to see and hold this book. And tomorrow night we'll actually get to see hundreds of other people see and hold this book, which is even more exciting.
Oh, definitely, right. And at this, there's a lot of things in that answer that I want to kind of touch on in this conversation, right? Especially when you do a bit of research on you, the notion of like you still prefer film, like more traditional approaches rather than the digital, which is interesting, right? But I think firstly, I'm interested in this, and you already mentioned it, but let's say moving country, which is something that you've done. Plus, you also then technically took up photography relatively late in life. I wouldn't say it's late, but it's not what you started with, right? And I'm very interested in transitions, right? What sparked that transition, and was that then you moving from the US to the UK? Was that part of that, or were you already starting as a photographer before that? What was kind of the tipping point, both for the move itself, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with photography, but also why do you make that transition and start, okay, but this is what I should be doing now?
So many layers involved in that. So photography did come to me late. I consider it late because I was about 30 when I picked up a camera and realized that I could treat it as a creative tool. Prior to that, I didn't think I had the skills to be a photographer, which I hear a lot of people say, and having gone through it myself, I kind of get it. When you see people make amazing work, or work that you think is amazing, or you see a picture you wish you'd taken and you don't know how to replicate it, it's very easy to make the leap to say, well, I can't do that, or I could never do that. And I think people do that with a lot of things. They do that with music. They do that with art of any sort, any medium. And so that was me. And for context, I've been a designer since I was about 15, 16. That's when I started teaching myself graphic design and started doing print-related projects, and very quickly got into the early days of digital design for the web and made a career out of that. And I had friends who were photographers. My second girlfriend was a super talented photographer, and I just was okay with that not being my thing. So I kind of wrote it off. And the way I got into it was Polaroid. It's actually all Polaroid's fault. If they hadn't discontinued their film, because they announced 2006 or 7, it was right around that time, where they announced they were discontinuing their pack film, as it's called, the traditional kind of classic Polaroid film that we know with the white border and a little thicker frame at the bottom. They announced they were discontinuing it, and I had a couple of design friends who already used and loved shooting Polaroids with the folding camera that originated that format, the SX70. It's a beautiful, beautiful object. Almost looks like a transformer. It starts flat and then you pull it and it kind of turns into this triangular thing. And I just thought, you know what? I need to shoot some packs of this before it goes away so I can tell my grandkids one day that I shot Polaroid. That was the only thought in my head. It was also an excuse to buy a camera that I thought it would just live on my shelf. I was like, this is going to be a great design object. It'll be on my shelf. I'll shoot a couple of packs of film and then I don't have to have FOMO anymore. And I shot those packs of film and it completely changed and transformed my relationship with photography that quickly. And it's funny because since then, pretty quickly after that, I researched the origin of the camera and the story of Edwin Land, the founder of Polaroid and the inventor of that camera and of instant photography. And that was the whole point for him of inventing that, was that photography was something that people looked at in the 60s, 50s and 60s as too hard and too time consuming. So it wasn't just the instant aspect. He wanted to make a camera that people could fit in their coat pocket and just take a picture with. And he achieved that. And it was crazy to me to see a camera that was designed and released before I was born, all those years later, when I was about, again, 29 or 30, that I could discover it and it would have the exact effect that it was designed to have. And as a designer, I loved that. So I just started falling into that rabbit hole of cameras, photography, trying to understand why it happened. I think it was more of a personal research project for my design brain than it was actually thinking that I would become a photographer. I was just really curious how I could go from believing I was not capable of taking a good photograph to instantly thinking the opposite and loving the images that came out of this camera. So I'd very quickly bought a digital SLR. I then bought a 35 millimeter film camera as well, and just started. I was learning, I was trying to experiment, I was trying to figure out what it was that had changed, whether it was just that camera, just that film, or if there was something else about me that had changed. It was a really fascinating few years of just trying with no purpose. It was totally a hobby because I was a full-time designer running a small agency. And then it just became a thing where when I would travel for work, when I would speak at conferences for design or tech, I would take my cameras with me and I would shoot when I was away. I'd almost never shot when I was at home in Miami. And the timing of this is quite important because 2006, 2007, I was just starting to travel a lot, speaking at conferences professionally. I was finding myself rather in all sorts of places that they were brand new to me. So I was seeing places for the first time, and having a camera with me just became part of that transition. Because we talk about transitions, I think it's really important that those two things happened to me at the same time. It wasn't planned, but it did. So the idea of travel and exploration for me in that way was tied to having a camera in my hand. So I would land in a new place, check into a hotel, and go out for a walk with my camera. And I was looking in a very different way than I ever had before. And then a few years later, this was also right around the time the first iPhone was introduced, which did not have a good camera. It had one, but it was basically a potato. And fast forward to 2010, really, we had an iPhone 4 and 4S were kind of introduced within that year. And most importantly, that was the year that Instagram was released. We just had a couple of days ago Instagram's 15th birthday, if you can believe that we've had a decade and a half of Instagram now, which is kind of scary. And I became, through my design connections, I was already testing, apps and websites and other things for other designers or for companies. That was a regular occurrence in my life. And a friend of mine introduced me to the founders of Instagram. No one knew that it existed yet. This was before it launched by 2 or 3 months. And I was invited to the beta to kind of test it, because in my design and tech circles at these conferences throughout the year, I was one of the people would ask for tips on how to use their cameras by that point. So I got invited to beta test Instagram when there were about 20 or 30 people on it, which is mental to think of now with as massive as it's become and how much it has changed the world. But that was another transition for me, where this thing that was a hobby that sat alongside and maybe sat behind design, but was growing and building. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with it. Suddenly, I found myself in a position where, when Instagram launched, some of my images were being used to promote this app that was making a big splash and very, very quickly becoming one of the most popular things out there. And that precedes it doesn't even precede my move. Again, it's really interesting to think back on these things and how serendipitous some of the timing was, because, Instagram launching had nothing to do with me moving countries. It just happened to launch in the year that I started living in the UK and was traveling more around Europe and Scandinavia, not just around the US and Canada. So everything's really intertwined, but these moments for me of transition from one creative thing to another also coincided with some other transition that was not coordinated. But I think that's how life actually happens a lot of the time, whether there's some good positive event in our life that precipitates some change in our action, or some negative thing in our life that also creates a change in our habits. There's a reason why so many artists are driven by negative things in their life, by why so many love songs are written out of heartbreak, why so many pieces of glorious art and literature are written when people have been broken up with, right? Or have lost a loved one. Our emotional state, whether positive or negative, drives every other decision that we make. So for me, I don't think that photography would have taken hold if I hadn't found that Polaroid at the same time as I was traveling and discovering new places. Those two discoveries were intertwined. Instagram came along at the same time as I'd moved countries. And so I was discovering even more things, but also it came along when the camera on the iPhone was suddenly good enough. So that's another kind of thing that I had no control over, but because I was curious at that point about photography, full stop, I became curious about what the phone camera could do and what apps could do. And that curiosity was what drove me to play and just say, I know photographers don't think this is anything special, but I know different. I think that this is going to become something big.
Yeah. And I think that's so interesting on many different levels. Like, first of all, it's almost a bit spooky, actually, right? How it all just fits together as a puzzle. But I think, because this is something that come up a few times on this podcast now, and I think just in general when I have conversation with people, because you can listen to, let's say, that part of your story and you can go, man, that's a lucky guy. Like, everything just kind of, fell into his lap and he was just there, right? But I'm one of those that argues that happens to everyone all the time, but not everyone is open to it. And I think curiosity is a good word to use, right? And I want to touch a little bit on this whole, or try to figure out maybe, like, where does that come from, right? Because for me, there's an openness to these things, right? Like, they happen. I think everyone has truth with moderation, but I think most people have an equal amount of opportunities, regardless of the starting point, regardless of what they're, let's say, born into. Sure, there's a lot of factors that's kind of impact where you can end up in life, right? But we all have some kind of journey to do, and we have, we're starting point A and we're ending at B. And throughout that journey, regardless of who you are, you will have a bunch of different opportunities, right? And some of them are very locked to them. Some of them are very open to it, right? And you're clearly a person that you're open to them, you tune into them, and then you make something out of that, right? Were you born like that?
Well, I don't know if I was born like that, but I always credit my parents with becoming like that. I wouldn't say I'm always the most positive person, because I think there's a difference. There are some people that you meet who are just this overwhelming positive force, and they just glow and they have an aura about them, and there's never anything negative that comes from them. I don't have that. I have plenty of struggles because of I'm a perfectionist. I'm always trying to do better than whatever I've done before, and I get very easily frustrated with myself and sometimes with others when I know that something can be better. But I'm also always going to be the first person who's championing someone else. Like I'm going to be the biggest cheerleader for a friend or for family because I have this belief that I feel I've always had that nothing is impossible. And I've proven that over and over again to myself, but I've also proven it to other people and helped people kind of see their way out of a mental block when they think that something can't be done. Because if you're willing to try hard enough, and this has a lot to do with capabilities and resources and other things. If you scale it up, right? Not everyone can create a reusable rocket like SpaceX was able to do. You have to have pots of money to be able to fund that and to be able to hire the really smart people who actually can do it. I think everyone really knows, even though Musk gets all the headlines for that, it's actually all of his engineers that have made that happen. But that couldn't happen without resources. But NASA couldn't make that happen. Someone had to believe that it was possible if they just basically threw enough resources at it, and if they believed that it could happen and found other people to work for them who also believed it can happen. And I think that works at that scale, and it also works on an individual scale. If you treat problems as something that are solvable, you might just not have found the solution yet or figured that out. You just need to spend more time at it. I think it unlocks a lot of possibility, and it allows you to go through life looking for possibility rather than looking for challenges. And I think that's tied very closely to what you said about being open. I'm thankful and honored that you recognize that in me, because I do believe that I'm like that. I like to see the possibility in everything. I get really excited about other people's ideas. It's why I'm really good at working for and with clients in my design career and in my photographic career, is that I end up treating the work, their brand, their product, as if it's my own. I have this ability to get really excited about what someone else is doing as if it were the thing I was doing. And when I find myself in that kind of conversation or that moment where someone else might be struggling, all I can see is all the possibilities that they have in front of them. And I'll just say, no, this is not a problem. No, look, here's your path forward. Like, look, I've lit the way for you. I know you can't see it yet, but trust me, if you do these steps, the thing afterwards will come. And part of this is also being willing to accept that something will happen, even if you don't know or are not in control of what that thing is that will happen. That's what momentum is all about. If you make a step, the step afterwards will come. The trick is that a lot of people get so focused on a single destination that they're unwilling to see the versions of that destination that exist to the left and the right of it. And I heard or read years ago, I think it was a video somewhere of Steve Jobs, who I've always been a big fan of in many ways, talking about how he liked to set goals for Apple. And I'm going to paraphrase horribly because it's been years since I've heard this, but I use this story a lot with clients and friends. He talked about putting a flag in the horizon, on the sand, as if you were stuck in a desert. You put a flag in the sand on the horizon, and everyone knows where that is, and you can point everyone in that direction. They know where they're going. It's not a very specific destination, though. It's so far away that you can point to it and get everyone going there. But if that position of that flag needs to move, it needs to move by 2 or 3 degrees on the horizon, or even more. Back here where you are, because you're far enough away from it, the adjustment you have to make to change direction is really small. And you have to be willing to know that that flag is a movable object. That destination, that goal, has to be slightly approximate. You have to say, I want to make this book. I want to make this product. I want to design a car. I want to make a spaceship, whatever it is that you want to do. Big or small, you have to be able to hold on to that really tightly and also be willing to let go of your grip when needs adjust. And if you do that, you can take the visible steps right now that, okay, well, I need to do this today and this thing tomorrow in order to get myself closer to that goal. But if the goal has to change in 6 months by a little bit or maybe a lot, it doesn't matter, because you've been making so much progress at that point that you've built up momentum, and that the momentum is the thing that I think starts to carry a lot of people forward into doing things that they didn't expect. And that's really, for me, when I look back, you mentioned something about everything seeming a little eerie, how well everything aligned and connected. And there's a Nietzsche quote that I would horribly paraphrase, but it's this idea of when you look back at your life, things make a lot of sense, but trying to look forward and anticipate what those things might be, no one has a clue. So you kind of have to have this trust and faith that if you're doing things with the right motivation and you're creating momentum for yourself, that eventually you'll look back and all of those dots will connect in a way that makes perfect sense. You just can't hold on to the idea that you can predict and control what those dots are going to be, what those steps are going to be.
True. The thing is, it sounds so easy when you say it, but I think it's one of those things that is actually incredibly difficult, right? And I think for me, it's my own journey. I've been too rigid in a lot of ways when it comes to my company and my approach to doing things in the coffee world. And I think that is sometimes because maybe, as you mentioned, it's hard to see that pin in a different version of that pin, right? Sometimes, and you get very like, no, I'm doing this now because in the end I'm going to get here, and then it's all going to be worth it. But the idea of doing this thing here now and maybe not ending up there, then maybe it's not worth doing what I'm doing now, right? And I think that's a constant kind of the challenge, which I personally kind of stumbled upon a few times in my career, which I'm also, you need to learn to get over yourself, trust yourself, and realize that now, but you have something to bring to the table, right? Both as a person, but also as a company or a project.
There are a lot of parallels in different industries, different artistic mediums. I've spent a lifetime on stage as a singer and also sometimes vocal coach, sometimes choral director. But when you're on stage, and I have friends who are actors who say the same kind of thing, a lot of people get in their own way, right? Because they have this singular vision of how the end result is supposed to be. And we're humans. We're not machines. We're not able to do the exact same thing every single time with that level of precision. You have to kind of allow yourself a little bit of room for the variation that happens with live performance, for instance. It's the level of quality that you expect from yourself and the training that you do to be able to execute at that level when the time comes. That's the part that actually matters. Doing it the same way every single time is the wrong goal, right? And I was also a competitive swimmer in my teens and my 20s, and it's very similar there as well. You practice over and over and over again to get yourself into a rhythm, get your form correct, get your strength up. But every race is going to be different. And you can't expect yourself to swim every race exactly the same way. What you can expect from yourself is to train consistently enough that when you show up, your brain and body react at a level. And that level is something that you can control more than the actual output. And I think when we talk about brands, when we talk about products, when we talk about even our individual journeys, right? Whatever that looks like for anyone. If we think about the training, the habits, people talk about habits a lot now, which I love, that the idea that the world and society at a certain level, especially with creative people and people who are makers and builders of brands, of products, whatever it is, that this idea of habit building has become a pretty strong topic of conversation. Everyone understands that that's really important. It's the habits day to day, even the habits that don't seem like they have any bearing on what you're doing. Those are the things that actually train you to execute whatever that thing is really well, because it's the unexpected things, the unexpected challenges of running a business, right? Those are the things. If running a business was exactly what you thought it would be, if you could plan 6 months ahead and there would be no surprises, nothing would go wrong, right? I mean, anyone listening to this is probably laughing because that just doesn't happen. There's no universe where that happens. But if all you plan for are the things that go right, then you're going to get very frustrated and maybe make some mistakes when things don't go right.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest about the fact that we are all better because it doesn't go the way we think, right?
Absolutely.
100%. Like that's why such a, almost everything that happened, I think, in my own journey, and I think in most creatives' journeys, is because how we deal with the things that comes that we did not expect to come, right? And I'm a huge, like, habits is everything. Like, I'm a huge, like, I mean, I think a lot of people think, I think I would be categorized as a very boring person in the sense that I have very strict schedule for myself, right? Uh, but it's the foundation that allows you to deal with the things that comes that you did not expect, right? And it's this kind of classic, to practice a little bit every day versus practicing, only for 1 week to do this test or whatever you're doing, right? And then you build long-term knowledge in a way that I think makes a big difference and creates a much, much better foundation for what you do.
I completely agree. And the interesting challenge for me is figuring out what those habits are without worrying too much about how specific habits will lead to a specific result. Because you can do that. Again, in music, you train your voice, you train to be accurate in intervals, you train your breath and your lung capacity. But it's because that makes you better at everything you're trying to do. So I could talk about running and how running, I could, I'm making this up on the spot right now because I haven't really had to have this conversation before, but I've been running for about 10 years now and doing half marathons. I'm doing my first marathon finally next year. I'm trying to get into triathlons as well. And for me, that directly relates to everything creative that I do. Even though there's not an obvious one-to-one relationship between those, but it's because I get so much thinking done when I'm out for a run, or if I'm swimming, or if I'm out for a ride. And also the structure that the training for a race and the preparation for a race gives me. It's the same kind of thing that I experienced performing on stage. And when you have to rehearse constantly and you've got some sort of output and you've got dates on the calendar, 6 months or a year or more in advance for a performance or a competition, that programs your brain in a way that affects everything else that you do. I'm a very big believer that much like our body and our movement, is kinetic, and every movement is connected to every other movement. I think that's the way our brains work. I think everything we do, it's just part of our pie chart of what makes up our brain and our interests. And I hate seeing people sideline an interest of theirs because they think that it would be a distraction or that it wouldn't help them get better at this other thing that they can't see the connection with. Because for me, it's like everything is connected. It's you're the connector. You're in that diagram, you are at the center of it. So it doesn't matter how different anything you're interested in or spend time doing seems. It doesn't really matter what it looks like to other people either. If it's something you are interested in and passionate about, you should pull on that thread and see where it leads you, because that's probably what's going to lead you to making connections that no one else who doesn't have those exact interests and passions would make. And that's what I've seen in myself. I had people, going back 15 years, right, where I wasn't a photographer yet. I took lots of pictures. I was a hobbyist photographer. I had never gotten paid for doing any photography work, but I knew I wanted to at some point. And I remember having conversations around the time that I moved countries, 3 or 4 years in maybe to having picked up that Polaroid camera. And people would ask me, people who weren't photographers, weren't creatives, they'd say, "Oh, so what are you going to do with this photography thing?" And I'd say, "Well, I don't know, but in the next 5 years, I would like to be getting paid for photography somehow." And their immediate question would be how. They wanted to know what that path would be. And I didn't care what that path would be, first of all, but I also didn't know. And I knew at that point, my life had had enough of these patterns of experience where I knew I didn't need to know. I just needed to know that marker on the sand was far enough away, 3 to 5 years, I'd like to figure out what that looks like. And that's, if I was saying that to people in 2010 or 2011, by 2013, I was getting paid to do photographic commissions. But I didn't know how that was going to look 2 years, 3 years out. Had no idea what shape that was going to have. And I certainly didn't know what it was going to look like today or even 5 years ago. And it's the same with my design career. It's the same with pretty much everything I've done, that if I follow my interests and if I trust my gut, right, which I know a lot of people don't like that term, gut or your intuition, because it's intangible and people don't like the intangible. We like data, right? There's the Googles of the world, if we think of people's brains, where it's all about data and you don't make any action unless you can prove it ahead of time, which happens a lot in the business world. Everyone's risk averse, that we need to be able to predict absolutely every possible outcome to reduce our potential risk. But if you live your life like that, what you're going to do is eliminate all sorts of possibilities, the majority of the possibilities of things that you can't predict, that might be great, that might be unexpected. And that's what leads to people being closed versus open. And I think this mindset is really, really dangerous, especially if you're a creative person of any disposition.
No, definitely. And I mean, the only difference between, I say this business-wise, I might be wrong, but I'm saying it anyway, because the only difference between you and the person doing what you want to do is probably effort.
Yep.
It's probably continuous effort over time. And I often say, and I think that's been a strength from mine, and it sounds like you're very much kind of on the same path, where people are often afraid going forward because they think they will lose what they have today, right? Like, I can't move country because I'm losing where I'm from, right? Just move back, right?
There are very few decisions in life that are irreversible.
Just go back. Everything, everywhere, almost, right? I mean, sure, there's exceptions to all rules, but in general, it's like, no, I can't try this new career, but you're already very good in your current career. Come back in 1 year and someone is going to give you a job. You're going to get money. You'll be fine, right?
I think that's actually where even if it's not conscious, I feel like that's where the idea of a gap year that the US doesn't have, but most of Europe and Scandinavia has and just takes for granted. I think that's kind of where it comes from and where the US gets it wrong, where it's this idea that if you take a break for a year from your education, you're suddenly going to forget everything you've learned. You'll lose this ability to sit in a classroom and study, or it's almost that bad in the US. They can't wrap their head around the idea, they being most people in the US, and definitely the people who design the systems. They can't understand how the break can be healthy, can be helpful in so many ways. And I think that's one of many examples that are easy to find in societies of these differences in mindset and the knock-on effects that it has, because we see very different decisions that people make in American culture versus anywhere else in the world almost. And you can point to, I like to point to a lot of seemingly small things like that, but it points to a bigger mindset difference. And yes, there are a lot of people in cultures that have gap years who still are afraid of change. I think that's a normal human thing. But the more examples that we individually can find where doing something differently to how we would normally do it has worked out fine for people, that actually helps us build a new mental model for doing things differently, like taking the risk, even looking at risk as being something other than risk. So I did a talk for a mostly education-focused audience years ago. I think it was 2006, somewhere in the US, Orlando maybe. And it was in my design and tech kind of world, and I was invited to speak at this event. And I wanted to talk about this idea of mistakes, of making mistakes, which is very tied into risk, and especially in US culture, especially in education. And I presented this idea to the audience that rather than think about things that don't go the way you expect as mistakes, to think about them as and frame them as experiments. Because if you think about experiments, the idea of an experiment is you don't know what the outcome is going to be. You have an outcome you think is likely, but you don't know. And if it goes the way that you think, that kind of confirms your findings. But if it doesn't go the way you think, you don't get necessarily disappointed. You've learned something. And then you run another experiment. You iterate, you revise your thought process because you have learned. And experimenting in that way doesn't prevent you from moving forward. But thinking about making a mistake does prevent you from moving forward. And the only thing that changes there is semantics. It's just what you use as the term. It's what you call it. And I find that happens in every language. We have this mental model that's based on the word that we use for a thing. And if it's a negative word, we have a negative relationship to that thing, to that thought process or that action. If it's a positive word, we have a positive relationship to that action. And you find that the people who tend to do a lot of things and find success in everything they do use more of the positive association words, and they never or rarely use the negative association words. And again, I've found that this crosses language barriers too. It's not a cultural thing, it's a human thing. The words that we use matter. And that's the words that we use for ourselves. There are people, I'm not one of them, but I actually really appreciate the people who will look themselves in the mirror every morning and give themselves a daily kind of affirmation and speak positive words to themselves. I don't feel I need to do that, which is why that's the only reason I don't do that. I feel like I'm already positive enough with my outlook on life. But I love it because I think that it clearly does have value. You can reprogram your brain by just saying nice things to yourself. By believing that you are capable of doing something, it changes your behavior and allows you to actually do that thing. Where all this ties in to kind of a way of being, whether it's photography, whether it's design, whether it's coffee. Let's take coffee, for instance, because I even though this is an interview and I'm the guest and you're the host, I hate things being all about me, and I talk enough as it is. You've started a coffee brand, a coffee roaster, and it's a lovely brand, and the coffee that I've had so far is also great. But it would be really easy for someone to say that it is already too crowded a market to introduce a new brand, especially in somewhere like Copenhagen, where there are a lot of good roasteries. From my perspective, I think Denmark is just really lucky to have as much fantastic coffee as it has. And I would never say that there's such a thing as too much. But there are people out there who would think it was a bad idea. And you might have even run into them or been surrounded by some of them. Or, when you started April, you might have had people, telling you that it was a bad idea, that there was no more room for another roastery, another coffee brand. And that mindset is the thing that mostly prevents people from doing a thing. There's also something I want to mention, because you hinted at it, whether you realized it or not. The fear of moving forward, of leaving something behind. I think there's also a really interesting counterpoint to that I've seen primarily in stage performance that limits people's advancement. And that's a fear of success. And this is a weird mental model that's required to think about a fear of success, because when I've brought this up to most people, except the friends of mine who are either psychologists or who have studied lots of psychology for product design or interface design, they get it. But it sounds like it doesn't make any sense. Like, why would anyone not want success? And it's not about not wanting success. It's about the fear of the unknown. And that's where what you said about people being scared of losing what they have in order to gain something comes into play. I think this is one and the same, but it's really interesting to look at it from different perspectives. I've known singers who had voices, had mechanisms that could be incredible, but they could never get there. They could never cross a threshold that would allow them to become better, to become great, because I think they were worried about what would happen if they got that good. Not necessarily consciously, but if you always come second place in a competition, you might hate it. You might want to come first. But the thing is, exactly how that feels if you have had it enough times. And there's a really interesting psychology that happens there with people who have had failures a lot, is that they start to expect failure and they start to get comfortable with failure. And this is a scary thing for me, because trying and trying and trying over and over and over again is often the path to success. But if you are too comfortable with the expectation of failure, then you stop trying hard enough. You stop adding that extra 1% that might tip it over. And instead, you limit yourself without even realizing it. And you only do what is necessary to almost make it. And I wish more people would talk about this and think about this. So hopefully anyone who's listening here, if this starts to ring bells, or you know someone in your life who is exactly like this, who you can see and you wonder why they aren't successful because they're so good, they should be. Look at them through this lens and look at your own actions through this lens, because we self-sabotage as humans, right? Not all of us, not all the time, but I tend to not do it in my professional life, but I've definitely done it in some personal relationships. And I can see it looking back. I'm like, I did that to myself. These self-inflicted errors. But this psychology is just fascinating to me, because as you said at the beginning of this, everyone's capable of doing so much more than they actually are doing. Everyone gets not the same opportunities, but there are opportunities everywhere. And it is just a matter of being open to seeing those opportunities, or having the blinders on like you're a horse in a race. And if you can't see those opportunities, how the heck are you ever supposed to take advantage of them and act on them?
Definitely. And I think it's so funny because as I mentioned to you before this as well, like I'm going up in a world championship next week, right? And it's such a great example of what you just said, because we have these, let's say, different personalities. We have the person that is like, no, I'm just going, like I'm happy to be there. It's a world championship. It's really cool. I don't have any expectation, right? And secretly they want to win, right? But publicly that's where they put the bar, so it's okay for them to not win, right? Then you have the person who goes up and shouts all over social media, I'm gonna win this. This is the best thing I've ever done, right? And often they come and they crash the hardest, right? And my approach has always been, and I think there's a balance between input and output. And I think that's something that I reflect upon a lot. And I'm a very input-focused person, right? So my input very often is not anchored in the output, like what comes out of it. I'm so focused on the process of what I'm doing. That translates to business, that translates to coffee, pretty much everything, right? The first year I wasn't looking at financial numbers. I was just so like, sorry guys, I'm making good coffee here. Like I'm trying to make good coffee. I don't care what comes out in the end. And funnily enough, that aspect of it also really worked out, right? But it didn't work out because I tried to make it work. It worked out because I was so focused on trying to create something specifically, right? And it's the same now when I'm going up next week, where I'm just having so much fun, right? The process is amazing. I'm learning, and I know that with the amount of effort I'm putting in, there's an opportunity for me to do really well. And I also know how difficult it is to do really well. But the real value in that is the input, right? Because if me failing or not in that process, it's not result-based per se. It's based on, did I as an individual bring to the table what I wanted to bring to the table, right? That's success or not success. Then someone else, in this case, will tell me whether what I brought to the table is good or not. Fair enough, right?
I think you just summed it up really well. We're not in control of the response to the things we do. And if we're setting our goals based on what other people have to think about what we do or how they react to what we do, that's the wrong metric, because we can't control it. We can only control what we put into it. So if, as you said, if what you're focused on in this competition is having fun and doing the best you can, I mean, you might do the absolute best you could possibly do in that moment, and someone else does their best and it's slightly better in the judge's eyes. And also, it might not be actually better than what you do, but the judges have to make a decision and they might decide otherwise. And a lot of the world is subjective, right? There are so many films that are 20, 30 years later seen as great films that did horribly at the box office, right? It didn't mean they made a bad film. It just meant that it didn't find the right audience right away. And I think the more that we, in business or in art, can be okay with that. It's difficult in in the way the world works, right? Especially when we need to pay our bills. If you're a performer and you need to sell tickets to a concert in order to pay your bills and then do the next concert, or you make a book like AJ and I have made and you need to sell that book in order to pay back all the money and time that you've spent making it and then allow you to make the next thing, you need to find that audience. So there's a lot riding on it. You start a brand, if there are no customers for your product, then it's very easy to think that maybe it was the wrong idea. I don't think there's a direct line between those things. I think there are a lot of good ideas that just don't hit their mark. It's not because they were a bad idea. They either didn't find the right time or there was something else that didn't go right. And that's where a lot of people give up. And it doesn't mean that everyone that you see having success doesn't have failures or got it right the first time. Some people do, but there's a great phrase out there that there is no such thing as an overnight success, right? If it seems like an overnight success, you have to peel back all the layers and find out how much work went in before that and how much failure there was. And often in the biggest success stories, what you find behind them is a lot of failure, a lot of lack of success, a lot of trial and error, and much more error than success. But no one talks about their failures, right? I mean, that no one wants to talk about their failures. You want to move on to the next thing. You want to learn what you can from them. Those people are the ones who end up succeeding. And it's a tough thing because especially if you love what you do and you're passionate about it, those failures, the thing that doesn't work, the thing that you put your heart and soul into and didn't get a good response or got a negative response, which is even worse, they hurt. We feel them. And I know that makes things tough. And I know anyone who's listening here, regardless of what it is that you do, that is the toughest moment to deal with. The going out on stage and making a mistake that the audience realized. I can remember absolutely everything that I have done wrong in front of an audience. I can remember every single client interaction that I've had in design or in photography where I got something wrong somehow. That in hindsight I could have fixed, but most of the time I didn't know I was going to get it wrong. So it's, it wasn't like I intentionally messed up, but we feel those and we remember them and we hold on to them. And there's something really cruel about that we, this tiny percentage of things that don't go right publicly, because if it goes right privately, no one cares. And we know that, and we can go, that didn't work. All right, well, I got to try that again tomorrow. It's the things that go wrong in public that most people are afraid of, and that holds people back from even trying. There's so much great creative work, great product ideas, great brand ideas that never get launched because people do all the work up until putting it out in public, and then they get terrified of what if someone doesn't like me? What if someone doesn't like my idea? I think that if there's any secret sauce or secret at all or recipe to living a productive creative life in art or in business, it is to accept that interaction, that is the payment that we have to be willing to make. We have to be willing to put ourselves out there and it not work. And if we're willing to do that, if we accept the disappointment before it comes, we can be a little bit more prepared for it. I've taught people that going out on stage, whether for public speaking or for performance musically, be okay with the idea that you might make a mistake. You probably will make a mistake. If you do it enough, you will make a mistake. If you travel enough, your bags won't show up at your destination, right? And we have to think about our own actions in that way. If you try something enough, you will fail in front of people. You will fall on your face, and it will make you better. Like you said earlier, it's the mistakes, it's the errors, it's the things that didn't go according to plan that actually make us better, that we learn the most from. No one learns a ton from their successes. No one learns a lot from something going exactly the way they thought it would go, because then you just try to do it again the same way. And if you're really lucky, maybe that'll work a bunch of times, but at some point it's going to fail and you won't know why it failed because you've gotten used to things just working. And the reality is that's not how it works. So we have to be just okay with it being messy and it being, unhappy sometimes, just like relationships. Matters of the heart, affairs of the heart are never simple and straightforward. Everyone wants a relationship to be happy all the time and to never have an argument or a disagreement. That's not how it works. the best relationships have a lot of disagreements and arguments. And I think if we treat the relationship that we build with our own work and our own art in that same way, the version of that argument, that disagreement is in there still. And even if that's with the general public, or if it's with ourselves and our frustration of what we're making, if we accept that, then it becomes easier. And you can go, all right, well, I knew it wasn't going to go perfectly the first time. I'm going to pick myself up and try it again tomorrow.
Definitely. And I think first of all, we are running out of time, which is very unfortunate because I have like a list of things I want to ask you and we haven't talked about half of it. But that's a good thing because we talked about a lot of very interesting things. And I want to just touch on one thing personally, and then I am going to ask you actually about something that you created, because it feels like we haven't really promoted you as much as we can in terms of, the work you brought into the world.
Well, that's not why I'm here. This has been a great chat.
It's been really interesting, actually, right? I think it's been, and I think this is, because the work itself is obviously important, and we link to all of it and all of this, but I think we got a bit of an understanding of where that work comes from. And I think that's far more interesting, right? And it's just to touch back on what you said about this idea of, let's say, don't start a coffee company in Copenhagen or Denmark or whatever, right? Or don't start one in general. I think that's really interesting because for me, a very big motivator in what I've done so far and what I continue to do is sort of a life perspective in a way, right? But the world doesn't need another coffee roastery. And I think that's very important to understand, right? The world doesn't need another photographer. In the sense of, if you're going to go up there and do what everyone else is doing, it's pointless. You're not adding any new value to where you are, right? But if you're picking up a camera and you use that camera in a way only you can use it, then you're relevant, right? That's the difference. And it's what you said with successes as well, right? If someone wants to, look at what you do or I do or someone else do, and okay, I'm going to be successful, so I'm going to do something that looks, sounds, acts like this other thing that is successful, it's not going to work, right? Because the most successful brands, people, art has all one thing in common, and that's integrity, right? It's a perspective of someone's self. And you can rely on that in the process because you are the only one that is you, right? So when you're holding that camera, you're going to carry that camera in a way that no one else will ever carry it, right?
Mm-hmm.
As I say, when I start a coffee roastery, if I allow myself, I will run a coffee roastery in a way that no one else would run a coffee roastery. That may horribly fail. That's fair enough, right? But it might also succeed. But I think that's the essence, right? Like that's the value you can bring to the table, which I think is interesting. Different note, and you have to answer quick on this, which is difficult because it's a big, long question. Your first book. I think that's a good way to kind of sum this whole conversation up, where it's like, because you then decide to put yourself out there. And I mean, you've done that before in different ways in different projects, but like your first book must be a very personal thing to do, right? You want to walk us through a little bit about that process, how you launched it, how you did it, where it came from, if it was a big step or if it wasn't a big step, and then we'll try to kind of round up after.
So the first book, my first photographic book, I co-authored a couple of professional books through my design career in the past, but those don't feel the same as something that is just yours that no one asks for. My first book came out in 2016. It was photographed in 2016 and then came out later that year. And it was interesting because it wasn't just my work. It was conceived of with a friend of mine in Japan, Craig Maud, a name that a lot of people who listen to this podcast might be familiar with. He is a very well-regarded and fantastic author and photographer and designer and multi-hyphenate. He and I were planning a walk in Japan through the mountains of central Japan. It was a version of a walk that he'd been doing for years with other people, and he had invited me to come on this in the spring of 2016. And at some point in our planning, a few months before, the idea came up that we should make a book out of all the photographs that we would be taking on this 8-day walk. Because otherwise, what are you doing with all the photographs you're going to take? We were talking about what cameras we're going to bring, and I think it just came out of that discussion. So we said, well, okay, we'll make a book. And it wasn't going to be a book for distribution. The idea was make a thing and make that thing as soon as possible after the experience, which is something that most people don't do. So this was a kind of creative challenge that we set for ourselves. So we planned the 8 days of the hike, and then we planned 4 days right after the hike where we would just camp out. We'd have our laptops sent to us, which you can do in Japan. We started in Tokyo and then got on a train and to start the hike. But before we left Tokyo, we couriered our laptops and a laser printer to the place we were going to be when we ended up. And they just show up there the next day magically and they're safe. So we got to this place, sat down. We had all of our photos. We shot digital. I shot some film on that, but it was all going to be the digital work. And we sat down for 4 days. We curated the work that we'd created, knowing that we just had this shared experience and we're seeing it from each of our perspectives. And it was made easier by the fact that I shot in color digital, and Craig had a Leica monochrome, the black and white camera at that time. And so all of his work was black and white. So we actually could see which was which and know what was his perspective and my perspective. And it was a really fun exercise to see how quickly we could curate these 8 days into essentially a sub 100 page book concept. And we actually did most of the design that week as well. It was a really fun exercise. And we got a couple of copies printed by Blurb, and it was like, oh, cool, we've got a book. That was where we thought it would end until we kind of were into it, and then we saw the book at the end. We realized this might be something other people would like too. Why don't we turn this into something a little bit more polished? And Craig had already had a successful book 6-7 years earlier. It was the first successful Kickstarter project for a book. It was for Art Space Tokyo. If you can find a copy, it's a great book. And so he already knew that Kickstarter was a good platform for this. He just hadn't put out another project like that on Kickstarter. So that was the idea. Let's fund this on Kickstarter. If people aren't interested, we won't make the book. We have our Blurb copies. That'll be it. And over the summer, we kind of polished the idea of the campaign and we polished the book itself. And we launched the campaign. Both of us very, very nervous, by the way. The night before, we suddenly had this fear of, oh, no one wants this. No one actually wants this, right? Like you said, no one needs another photo book. Certainly no one needs or has asked for a book about a hike in Japan from 2 white guys, right? Like we were really, really hyper conscious of that, even though through the design process, we had tried to not make it that. We were trying to make it something that was very, very much about sense, about what it felt like to be there, not about our opinions of what we saw, but just our observations, which are already biased, but we wanted to have a feel to it and try to get our bias out of the way as much as we could. But we flipped the switch and we funded the thing. And in a 3-week campaign, we funded it more than double what the printing cost was. So we sold over a third of the books of 1,000 run in that Kickstarter campaign, which was incredible. It was a response that neither one of us really expected at the time. And the book itself, it sold out over the course of another 2 or 3 years, I think. And it's the great thing about an art book, especially, as long as you're not being charged a lot or anything to store those books until they sell, your profit margin is the same. If it takes 4 or 5 years to sell out, you make the same amount of money on it. So the trick is figuring out how to not spend a lot of money having them sit somewhere until they sell out. So it sold out in about 4 years, I think, right before the pandemic. And it was just this amazing experience to create this thing. We launched it. I flew back to Japan that November to actually have the book launch, and we signed all the copies and we numbered all the copies. And we still meet people online and sometimes in person who have a copy of the book, people we've never met and don't know, who just found it or bought it as part of the Kickstarter, found their way to it because they were interested in something about Japan or about walking. Craig has actually met people on that same walk in subsequent years who were doing the walk because they bought the book and it inspired them to go to Japan and do the walk, which, if you know the Kumano Kodo, like the likelihood of meeting anyone while you're walking it is really low in the first place. The likelihood of meeting someone while you're walking it who is walking it because they bought the book that you made about walking it it boggles the mind. But I think it ties into everything we've been talking about today, which is that this idea of mindset has a lot to do with where people's energy ends up going. And it's why the more open you are, the more people you meet who are also open. And those connections end up making other connections. And that's how you create a network of people who are open and interested and who you feel safe suggesting some weird idea to, because you know you won't be judged for it because you're saying it to someone who also has weird ideas, and you're probably going to get encouragement, if not maybe a business partner out of it. Right. And I love that what happened because of making that book is that I have made other books for other people, and I will make other books for myself, because you have to start. So it was intimidating at first. There were nerves involved, but because I wasn't doing it myself, I was doing it with someone else who had already done it. Craig, by that point, had designed probably 20 or more books for other people, in addition to the one for himself. So I knew that the process of making the book, the parts that I wasn't familiar with, even though I'd been a print designer for decades at that point, I knew he knew the things I didn't know. So I didn't have to stress about them. And I learned a lot in the process. We had it printed in Japan. I didn't have to pick the printers. We used a printer Craig had used before, and he trusted them. So I trusted them. And this kind of trust transference actually happens a lot. Again, when you know other people who are open, you can learn things without having to fully learn them, because you've got someone else who actually knows more than you, and you're okay with them being the source of that knowledge. So I feel like Koya Bound, which is the name of the book, and you can actually still find the website that we put together for this, because that's one of the parts of the Kickstarter campaign, was that if it hit a certain mark, we would actually design a custom website that put more information about the route and the journey and the data behind our walk than we were actually putting in the book. We didn't want the book to be that, but we had all this data. We had loads more pictures. So there's still a website up that Craig kind of still hosts that is more of a travel log of these 8 days and where we stayed and the elevation and the number of kilometers we walked each day and how long it took us to walk these kilometers, and more pictures. And it's a brilliant website. And that's the other thing. These books sold out. Those 1,000 books will live on. They're not going to end up in a landfill. They're going to be too special to whoever had them. And it's crazy to think that someday every copy of those will be left to someone's kid or to someone's grandchild. And even if they get rid of them, they're probably not going to throw them away. They'll donate them to a library or to a used bookstore or something like that. Books are fantastic in that way. But we also have this digital representation of this thing. So I look very favorably on the experience, because I don't remember any of the nerves other than the night before we switched on the Kickstarter campaign, where we actually dropped the price of the book on the Kickstarter by about $20, because we were like, no one's going to pay this for it. And as it turned out, people did pay it for it, because that was our retail price and they still sold. And so, all that goes to show is that even people who do a lot and are really confident outwardly, we still question every decision. We still believe at some point, even if it's just for a millisecond, that our idea is maybe too crazy and that no one's going to believe it or believe in it or like it or buy it or whatever else. The thing that differentiates us and other people who do those things is that we have that feeling and we do it anyway. And that's the big takeaway, I think, is that just do it anyway.
I mean, it's get over yourself.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a big part of it. Right. And I'm gonna break my own rules now, because I have one more question, which I expect could have a long answer, but I need to ask anyway because I'm very curious. Like, what's next? We haven't talked about the future at all, and I'm assuming that's a really big chapter if I'm opening that door right now. But I'm gonna let's give us a glimpse. Who's checking as well?
Well,
5-minute answer.
What's next is always a massive answer for me, so I won't try and actually answer it for the sake of everyone who's listening and time. But I think that's what's always been interesting to me, is that what I'm doing right now is usually a lot more than a lot of other people, but it's also all I have time for. Even if it's right now, I probably have a couple of dozen projects in various stages of completion, working with other people, where some working on my own. Never all working on them at the exact same time, right? But they're all in my head in some way, shape, or form. But they're the things I'm doing right now, and I'm curious to see them out in the world. But they're what I'm doing right now, and I know what those are. They're exciting, but they're not as exciting as the things I don't know. that might be around the corner. What I'm always really curious about is when I finish a thing, when I put an idea out into the world, when I finish a project, when I finish doing something for a client, when I finish having a podcast interview, what's going to happen because this gets out into the world and people I don't know listen to it? What's the knock-on effect of that? You can never predict it. And I think that's amazing. That's the most exciting thing to me. So I'll try and answer this by answering a different question that I've gotten a lot, but it feels the same to me. People have asked me for the last maybe 10, 12 years since I've been doing a lot of photography that revolved around travel and locations. People ask me about, what's my favorite place I've been? And I always had a really hard time coming up with that answer because I love everywhere. And when I'm in a place, I'll probably love it more than any other place I've ever been, especially if it's I'm seeing it for the first time. And I realized that the answer for me was the next place I haven't been yet. That's my favorite place, is the next place that I have yet to discover, because I will always like going back to other favorite places. But there's something really unique about seeing a place and experiencing a place on this planet for the first time, because I will never see all of this planet. I will never be able to go to all of the places that I want to go. And I know never is a really long time, but I have a long list. And if I were somehow able to physically travel to every one of those places, every other day of my life, I might get to it, but I also am practical enough to know that that's not going to happen. So I have to triage and at some point go, I might not ever see that thing or do that, be in that place at that particular time of year. I'll still try, but and with projects, with ideas, I feel like that's the same. I don't know where I'm going to be 5 years from now. I have an idea. I have a couple of sticks in the sand on the horizon that I'm working towards. I've got a consultancy that I run with my partner, Ellie, and we've got some really fun projects of our own that we are doing under that umbrella of the consultancy, because it's not just a consultancy. We're kind of trying to figure out what shape it has. We don't want to be an agency. We don't want to be just a consultancy on its own. We're kind of turning into a little bit of a think tank and trying to bring other people into it as well. We want to work with our friends. We want to bring people who we don't know yet into that so that we can become friends with them and build things that are bigger than ourselves. I've got a book project that's starting later this month that'll come out next year that my partner and I are making. I'm doing a lot of work with stereoscopic photography, which has fascinated me forever. And it's really exciting to be doing that, which is 3D photography for anyone who doesn't know. 3D photography is this old form of photography, but it's now been made new again by things like Apple's Vision Pro and Meta's Quest headset. But it's this thing that can live quite naturally in the physical world and the digital world. And that's really exciting because it's like folding two ends of a book together. And I could continue on like this because there's a range of products that fit into the coffee category, actually, that I have been working on with a couple of friends. There are so many things that actually the only way that I keep any of it straight is by not thinking about them most of the time. And it's the only way that I think I don't completely unravel and go a little bit nuts, is that I'm okay with there being a lot of things on my mind that I don't spend time on every single day, because they don't need time every day yet. But it's exciting for me to have all that possibility to pull on those threads, because not all of them will happen. Not all of these ideas will end up coming to fruition. But if I don't explore them, if I don't maintain my curiosity, if I don't continue to have the conversations, if I don't act and live as if they might become real, then they definitely won't. And so that's what's next, is hopefully not more of the same, but stuff that I can't even predict at this point.
I think after this conversation, I don't think it will be more of the same, because there's nothing so far in your life that has been there. But I think there's also just a beautiful note to end on the whole idea of, like, if you don't do it, it's not going to get done. And isn't that motivation enough to just do it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if you start, at least you have a chance.
Exactly.
Right? And if you don't start, you don't have a chance.
Exactly.
It's really that easy, right?
Yep.
Dan, I want to thank you. This has been amazing. This has been a very different conversation than what I maybe thought it would be, but probably also a better one. I hope all of you enjoyed watching and listening as well. We're going to continue with more of these episodes as well. And we're going to make sure that everyone can follow you, links and everything, so that see what they're up to. And I'm very curious to follow you in the future as well and see what will come. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Amazing.